Part 2. As a continuation of Part 1, Part 2 of this video series will discuss the secondary and tertiary barriers to economic development on reserve. The secondary barriers are the following: deficits in infrastructure, deficits in capacity, and lack of support. These barriers reinforce and bleed into one another, hence the overlapping circles depicted in the image. Deficits in infrastructure create major barriers to sustainable economic development in First Nations communities. In one source, poor roads, unsafe water supply, and substandard telecommunications infrastructure on reserve are identified as significant barriers to economic development. Meeting basic human needs like access to safe water and healthful housing for all community members must be prioritized in discussions around economic development on reserve. Barriers related to deficits in capacity arise often in the literature. A general lack of human resource capacity leaves communities ill-equipped to take advantage of economic opportunities in their region. A lack of support internally and externally is identified in the literature as a barrier to economic development on reserve. The Great Bear Co-op in Deline, Northwest Territories, points to a lack of internal support from community leadership as a significant challenge. Communities consulted for an Alberta-based report explain how there is not enough external social and financial support for transitioning into educational institutions, training, apprenticeships, employment, or the workforce. Keeping in mind the omnipresence of the primary barriers, the secondary barriers are thus inextricably linked. A lack of support reinforces and contributes to deficits in infrastructure. Without the proper infrastructure, First Nations on reserve experience deficits in capacity, and of course, deficits in capacity further feed into an overall lack of support in communities. The tertiary barriers are the following: lack of access to training and education, lack of skilled labor, inadequate planning and management, suboptimal governing structures, inaccessibility, and challenges to gaining employment. A number of publications reviewed for this report cite barriers related to lack of access to quality training and education. Representatives from the Tunaksa-Kinbasket Tribal Council call for more training and education to equip members with business skills and expertise. Access to quality training and education is also required for members to secure meaningful jobs. A federal report published in 2009 identifies a lack of skilled labor as one of 6 main barriers to economic development on reserve. Inadequate planning and management happens because of deficits in capacity and suboptimal governing structures. 2 of the publications chosen for review identify a lack of governance capacity as squashing any chance of economic development on reserve. In one report, limited access to funding for First Nations is a barrier to carrying out the planning process. Here we see the direct influence of a primary barrier, namely financial restrictions, on a tertiary barrier. Many First Nation reserve communities are situated in remote areas, far from urban economic hubs and major markets. This remoteness and inaccessibility intensifies when deficits in infrastructure are present. An inaccessible community contributes to the challenge of gaining employment. A complete lack of jobs in or near Aboriginal communities is one significant challenge to securing employment. If community members are unable to find meaningful work close to home, community economic development suffers.